Hello and welcome. I'm Brian, the Clueless Guru, and today we're going to be installing Cali in VMware Player. Cali is a Linux distribution that already has a bunch of security tools already installed on it. There are other alternatives out there as well, such as Black Arch and Parrot OS, and many others. But I like Cali. It's one I've used for a long time, even back when it used to be called Backtrack. This is a platform that is maintained by Offensive Security and a large open source community that is supporting all the tools that go into it as well. What we're going to do today is we are going to walk through every step of the way. So if you are new to the idea of virtualization, VMware Player, Cali, installing it, this is what we're going to cover today. And all the way from downloading an installation image to running it and getting it to our first boot up and get to our first terminal. There are other virtualization software out there as well. You can use VMware Player, Workstation, Fusion, all of those will work. There's also Oracle's VirtualBox, there's Hyper-V, Docker, and a ton of others. So for today's purposes, we're going to focus on VMware Player. It's free and available to download right from VMware's website. So VMware Workstation Player. And right at their website, vmware.com/products workstation-player.html. And you can just click on the download now, and that'll take you through the process of downloading your files and then install VMware. Once you get installed, good chance you'll have to restart, and that's okay. Do that, restart, and you're good to go. Next up is to get Cali. So there's a couple of options when it comes to Cali. You go to cali.org, you go to their downloads, and download Cali Linux. And so today what we're going to be covering is going to be the Cali Linux 64-bit installer. There are other options where you can just download the images for the appropriate virtualization software right out of the box, so you don't actually have to do the installation yourself. For some people, that might work out. For me, I've always been accustomed to download and install straight from the ISO, because sometimes I also install directly to bare metal, directly to a laptop or a desktop computer, and also I feel like I just have a little bit more control when I install from an ISO, and I also can understand the platform a lot better when going through it. So that's an option as well. You can just go to the Kali Linux 64-bit VMware and go to their official download page and download it from there. That's not what we're doing today. So simply, we're just going to go to Kali Linux 64-bit installer and click on that. Thankfully, Cali is supported by a lot of people the world over, and many have graciously offered server space for mirrors that are a good pace. And so at this point, we're looking at downloading 3.7 gigabytes in about a minute. And so let's just take a moment for that to download. And while that's happening, let's get started with our VMware Player. So when you first come into VMware Player, you will be greeted with this screen, and it's going to simply just be the player, play, a few settings, and then welcome to VMware Workstation 15 Player, or whatever version. And so here, we're just going to create a new virtual machine. So you click on that. And for our purposes, we will install the operating system later, and we will do this. Some of the other options are, if you have a physical disk, you can read right from your physical drive, or if you have an ISO that most commonly like Windows, VMware will just automatically install it for you. You just give it some data and it'll run with it. But in this case, we'll install it ourselves. So we click Next. And from here, we want to specify the guest operating system as Linux. And the version, we'll just pick the latest Debian 64-bit release. So in this case, Debian 10.x 64-bit. And then we'll click on Next. Now let's give it a name. What do we want to call it? And so in this case, we'll just call it Cali. And then we'll just let it save to the default location here. So next again. Maximum disk size, we'll just leave it at 20 gigabytes. And it's usually about 8 to 10 gigabytes, if I recall correctly, when the installation is complete, depending on the options that you select when you install. And what we'll do is we'll split the virtual disk into multiple files. So what this is going to do is it is not going to use up the entire 20 gigs right away. It will use up pieces of it at a time. So even though you allocate 20 gigabytes, it's not going to use up an entire 20 gigabyte block of your hard drive. And so multiple files, and we'll click on next. And here, technically, you are done enough, but I like to do some customized hardware here. And in some cases, for example, we don't need a printer, so we'll remove that. And memory, 2 gigs is sufficient. It's up to you if you want to move it up and down. I personally just tend to give it 4 gigs because I have 16 gigs on the system and I have enough to do that with. You can get away with like possibly even 512 or a gigabyte. So it's up to you and what you can afford. And then as for the processors, I like to have at least 2 or more processors when I'm at work. So we'll set it to 2 here. And then our CD drive, this is where we're going to mount our ISO. And the ISO is that file that we downloaded from Cali. And so we will click on here and go to Browse. And in our Downloads folder, we will see that the file that we had just downloaded, Kali Linux 2020.3 installer. And so we'll select that. And everything else is already in place. So one other option when you are setting up a virtual machine is going to be the network adapter. And how do you want that to interface with your network? You have options such as NAT, which basically means that nobody else on your network can see this device except for your main machine that this is running on. And it will kind of hide it from the rest of the network. And all communications that come out of the VM go through your host machine and onto the network. Another option is to do bridged mode, which effectively makes it look like that it is sitting side by side on the network as if it was 2 separate computers. And then there's also host only, which kind of restricts it even further than NAT and doesn't allow you to do some other fancy networking inside of it. And then you can also do custom specific virtual network and LAN segments, which we won't be covering today. And so for our purposes, we will leave it as NAT. And so at this point, we've covered everything here. We've got it all ready to go. And we click close. And then we are greeted again with our summary screen, and we will click finish. Great. Next up, let's get started with our first virtual machine. So we'll power it on, click on play up here, double click here, play down here, and let's get started. So when you first start up a virtual machine, it's going to default to going through a few different mediums to try to find something that it can boot to. And so the hard drive is not bootable yet, so it's going to jump into the CD or DVD drive, which is what we have mounted here with the ISO. It's basically a CD or a DVD. And now we've booted into the initial landing of that DVD file. And then we're greeted with options on what do we want to do from here. And so we'll do a graphical install. And so we'll just hit enter. And if you're having issues getting your virtual machine to register your keyboard and mouse, and then make sure that you click inside of the window to make sure that VMware captures those devices. And if you need to come out of there, in most cases, you can just move your mouse out of that window and it will break out of that jail, essentially. In the event it doesn't work that simply, is you hit Control and Alt on your keyboard at the same time, and that will release Control as well. So back to it, select your preferred language, click on Continue, and your location, Continue, keyboard, Continue. And then we'll give it a moment for it to get some more options for us. Okay, so now we are at a prompt asking us for a host name. What do we want to call this computer? For this case, we're just going to simply leave it with the name Cali. Depending on your purposes, or if this is for a work environment, or you just want to be creative, this can be almost anything that you want it to be. So again, we'll just stick with Cali, and we'll click Continue. And domain name, in most cases, you can just leave this empty. If you know specifically your network requires additional information here, you're welcome to put that in. And now it's time to set up a user. So with Cali in version 2020.3, they implemented a standard user to be used instead of just going right into root, because Cali has become so popular that they wanted to be a little bit more new person friendly, but also to be a day-to-day driver. So in this case here, we will enter in the full name of our user as Clueless Guru, and then we will click Continue. And for our username, we will have it as Clueless Guru. And this has to be no spaces, just one word, and typically lowercase. And continue. And now we need a good password. And so in here, we will put in a password, and then we will do it again. If you need to see what your password is, you just click on the Show Password and Clear, and it will show you what you've typed. Otherwise, let's proceed. Continue. Select your time zone. So the next step is to set up our hard drive, and how do we want to have it laid out? So this is where running it in VMware Player, at least for the first several times as you get comfortable with installing Linux, within VMware, you have a dedicated hard drive as far as the operating system is concerned. And so in this case, we can actually use guided, use entire disk. If you are installing it directly onto your laptop or desktop or shared with another operating system, this gets to be a little bit more complicated, and this is outside of today's scope. And so here we are going to use guided, use entire disk. Some other options too would be use entire disk instead of LVM, and that makes it easier to resize your drives. And then there's also use entire disk and set up encrypted LVM. And this is where it would require you to enter in a password in order to access that hard drive. So we'll click on Continue and select the hard drive that we set up initially and continue. All files in one partition, which is recommended for new users. You can also do it as a separate home partition or separate home, var, and temp partitions as well. And for my purposes, I always just do all files in one partition. It's simple, straight to the point, and it's very common when I'm creating Cali machines. They are meant to kind of be disposable, quick use ones. Okay, so let's continue. And this is the overall layout of what it's going to look like. And so it's going to create a new primary partition of 20 gigabytes. It's going to format it as an extension 4. In the Windows world, this would be like NTFS or FAT, but in this case, extension 4. And it's going to be mounted at root or slash. And then another partition, which is a logical partition, and it's slated to be 1 gigabyte in size, to be formatted as swap space. And what swap is basically a situation where if you run out of physical memory, then it will move over to using swap space as a virtual memory. So that's going to be a lot slower. And this is something that's just kind of auto configured. If you need that space, you can go back and you can manually reconfigure it to only do the extension 4 in the root and not do a swap at all. So that's up to you. Again, that's outside of the scope, but that is a possibility. And so with this, let's finish the partition and write changes to disk. Click continue. And then one last check, are you sure you want to do this? And so this is a situation that if you are installing this with something else that's installed on the hard drive, this is where you want to double check and triple check to make sure that you are working with the appropriate hard drives. In this case here, this is SDA. So this is telling us that it's a solid disk, A as in the first one. And it's going to be the first one because it's the only one on this machine. And so we know that it's okay to do. It's okay to overwrite the entire disk. And so we will write the changes to disk. We click yes and click continue. Okay, so next up, we are at the software selection. And by default, Cali has moved over to using the X-Face desktop. And this is a kind of a simplified desktop that seems to be very lightweight and responsive. And so we're just going to leave X-Face as checked. But if that's something that you don't want, or you want to experiment with some of the other ones, you can also select Gnome or Kde Plasma. So Gnome is going to be kind of a step up from X-Face. It's going to be offering you some additional features and some more robustness. And Kde, from my experience, it's robust, but it's also a lot shinier. And what I mean by that is like the window manager, it's much prettier to look at and a little bit more of an enjoyable experience for a casual user. And so I would say if you've got time and energy, maybe check them out and see what you think. Or at least do some image searching and look at Gnome desktop screenshots or KDE screenshots and get an idea on what kind of interface you want to have. And then there's also the collection of tools. Obviously, clicking on that doesn't actually do anything, as the note says. But then we include the top 10, the most popular tools, and then the default, which is the recommended tools. And in most cases, pretty much 99% of the cases, this has met my needs for the testing that I do, which is commonly around like web testing and fuzzing and network testing and things like that. And so we're just going to leave it at this. And later on in other videos, as we introduce new tools, if they're not installed by default, then we'll talk about what does it take to install them. And so with this, let's click on continue. So from here, it's going to grab everything off the DVD or the ISO, and it's going to install it. So this is the part that's going to take the most amount of time. And so we'll be right back as soon as this is done. Okay, so after a while, if there's no activity on your screen, VMware will just go black. Think of it as a screensaver. And so you can just click in there, move your mouse around or whatever, and then it will start working again. And so we've finished that initial install of software. And so now we get to a screen where it's asking us to install the Grub Bootloader. So with the Grub Bootloader, this is Linux's way of telling us what are we going to boot into. And when it comes to running it in a VMware or VirtualBox or wherever, since it's the only operating system that's going to be ran, we don't have to get fancy or complicated with it. If you're looking at dual booting with multiple operating systems on the same box, then you have to go through a few additional steps. And so in this case, this is the only one on this machine. So install to the primary drive, click on yes. And you can either enter the device in manually or just select the only hard drive available and continue. So here it's going to finish up the installation. And let's just give it a moment. Okay, excellent. Finish the installation. And so now that it is done, it tells us to remove the installation media, and then it will just boot into the new system rather than back into the installation medium. And what's nice about VMware Player is that by default, it checks the hard drive first if something can boot, and then the CD drive, so we don't necessarily have to worry about that in this case. And so let's just click on continue. And now the reboot. So the Grub Bootloader is what prompted us to see what we wanted to load into. And in this case, there's only Cali. So that's what we booted into. And here is your first login screen. So if you made it this far, congratulations, you have installed Cali. But that's not all. Let's log in. So with the user that you originally created, in this case, Clueless Guru, and the associated password, and then we click login. Perfect. So this is what your default desktop is going to look like. And similar to a Windows fashion or other OS that you might be familiar with, the start button, equivalently the start button, would be the dragon up here in the corner. And you click on that, and here's a listing of a bunch of different software that's available on here. So for example, under information gathering, you have all of these options in here, and you have DNS analysis and a couple of tools associated with it all the way down the line. Vulnerability analysis, web applications, etc. And that's one way to become familiar with the tools that are in Cali. So another option would be to open up Firefox. And so we click on the start button, go to Firefox. And when that loads, we click on Cali Tools. And this will give us information about all of the different types of tools that are on here. And for example, information gathering, vulnerability analysis, wireless attacks, etc. And here's a listing of a bunch of the tools that are already available on here. Another great resource is going to be Cali Training. This is if you want to get really in depth and really understand what Cali is doing behind the scenes, and also just how to operate it day to day. So this is, again, a great resource, and I highly recommend going through it if you're looking at pursuing a technical career that requires an understanding of Linux. Next thing that we'll talk about is going to be package maintenance. So let's open up the terminal here and click on the terminal emulator, and you will be greeted with your username at your hostname prompt. And so what the package manager is we are using apt in order to do our work. So apt. And this is a repository of programs that is being maintained by the Cali offensive security and basically the world over, everybody who is helping out this project. And so first what we need to do is we will need to update our list of software. And since we're a regular user in this case, we will do sudo apt update. And then we have to enter in the password for our account. So we do that. And now that is done. And so in this case, there's 905 packages that can be upgraded. And so what we can do is we can either run apt list -- upgradable to see the list, or we can jump right into upgrading them. And typically when I first do an install, I'll go straight into just going ahead with the updates and upgrades. So we will do sudo apt upgrade, and now it will provide us with a large list of all the programs that will be affected. As we can see, there's a good number of them here. And we'll jump back down to the bottom. So there's 875 here that will be upgraded, and 83 that will be new, and then 30 not upgraded. And then it will have to go out and grab 1.7 gigabytes of files. And by the time this is all said and done, it's going to end up using up another 683 megabytes of space in this case. Depending on when you do yours, these numbers are going to vary, and that's okay. And so do we want to continue? You can either just hit enter for yes or Y and enter. And now it's going to go through, and first it's going to download every single file that it is going to need. Once the download is complete, then it will process the actual installation instructions and install all of them. And for this first time, it is going to take a while, and that's okay. So during the installation process, we will see that it will prompt us to answer various questions. And so in this case is restart services during package upgrades without asking. In this case, we'll just leave it at no and hit OK. And then services to restart, just hit enter. And when it comes to the initial installation and initial upgrade of all of the software, in most cases, it's going to be okay to just tell it to do whatever it was planning on doing. And whether that is relocating certain files, maybe updating certain configuration files, or restarting services, it's okay to generally let those go through and happen. And so, for example, in this case, change the home directory of IRC from this location to that location. That's okay. And so we'll just hit yes and continue. And these prompts may be different on your machine depending on when you do your upgrades and where you kind of started off with. So this is the case from version 2020.3, and it's been out for a little bit of time, and so that's why there's so many packages to be upgraded. When the next release comes out, it's going to be a smaller list at first, and it's just going to grow over time. Okay, so just another prompt, and sometimes if the button isn't automatically selected, hit tab and then it should highlight and click OK or enter. Okay, so our upgrade has completed, and a couple other things that we'll do first is we are going to clean up some of the old files that are no longer needed. So with that, we will do sudo apt auto remove. And depending on how long it was since the last time you entered in your password for sudo, you may be prompted again. And so in this case here, there's going to be 33 items that get removed. And this is usually a pretty quick and painless process to do. And then to free up some space, we will do a sudo apt clean, and this is going to remove a bunch of the apt cache. And in cases where you are very tight on space, this is a great place to start to try to free up some of that space. And now through this overall upgrade, we installed an updated kernel and a bunch of other software, and just to make sure that we are loaded into that kernel, we will simply just do a restart. And so we'll click on the arrow in the upper right hand corner, the circle with an arrow pointing out of it that says log out. We'll click on that, and typically when you're done with the day, you click on shut down, but in this case we'll just click restart. And log in as usual. And then here we are, back to our desktop. A fancy new wallpaper in this case, and everything just by doing the upgrade. So with VMware and VirtualBox, they can communicate with the guest operating system using something referred to as VM tools. And that's something that is already installed with our Cali instance. And that allows us to do some nice features. In some cases, that allows us to set up like a network share to be able to communicate between the host machine and the guest machine, allowing us to move files back and forth quickly. Some other cases are to drag and drop files right from the desktop to the other desktop. And another one is automatic window resizing. And so in this case, if we just wanted to maximize our VMware player window, it will automatically maximize the window inside. Another option is we can jump right into a full screen mode, which then it takes up the entire screen as if this was your sole computer. And this is great. It's already built in and it works. And as you can see, this operates just like a regular Windows that you are familiar with. You can click and drag and drop, move windows as you normally would. You can have multiple windows open at the same time, as you can see here. And now you have Cali installed. And this is kind of where our journey begins. This is where we are going to be running most of our software and various programs. There'll be cases where we need to use Windows or other platforms, but a majority of our testing is going to be done from a Cali instance. And stay tuned for the other videos where we go and actually talk about some of the different programs and get up to speed in technology, whether it's going to be for systems administration, network administration, or from a security researcher, pen testing, red teaming perspective. That's going to be kind of our focus, and this is kind of where we want to start from. So if you like this style of teaching and this workflow, please like, subscribe, get this name out, and let's continue to learn together. I'm Brian, the Clueless Guru, signing off.